So this project was inspired by a small leather-bound album, which is part of the Kresen Kernow collections. You can see it on the screen. I first saw the album when it was displayed for a school visit, and our then learning lead commented that we didn't know anything about the L Opie, who had written their name on the first page there, and presumably compiled the album. Intrigued and excited, I set out to see what, if anything, could be uncovered about L Opie's identity, life, and family, and these discoveries will be the focus of this talk. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the sources and methods used to carry out this research. The album dates from the later stages of the First World War and includes photographs, drawings, and autographs of military officers and nurses. And as it has been digitised, I thought it would start the talk by having a look at it. Okay, so the first step is to identify L Opie, and I defined identifying her as knowing her full name and vital dates, as this gives the most basic outline of her life. The project therefore started with the research questions: when and where was L Opie born? When and where did L Opie die? And if she married, when and where and who did L Opie marry? Now, these questions are currently far too unfocused. So I could pick a birth for someone with a name beginning with L and a surname of Opie anywhere within, say, the United Kingdom, any time from, say, 1870 to 1899, presuming she was aged between 18 and 45 when the album was compiled. But how would I know that that record related to the L Opie I was looking for? And if there was more than one record, as I imagine there would be, how would I choose which record relates to my L Opie? I can't at this point, and that is why I said those questions are too unfocused. I have no identifying information, such as an approximate date of birth, a location, or an occupation in these questions, to use to compare with information found in other records to make a judgment of how likely a record relates to the person I am looking for. This is why it's important before starting any research to think about what you already know. In family history research, this normally involves interviewing older relatives and looking at old documents and other memorabilia. To identify L Opie, I had to really carefully study the album itself and its catalogue entry. So the original catalogue entry for L Opie's album, it's been updated to include some information found out about L Opie and her family, revealed very little. L Opie was identified as a nurse working at Scoria Convalescent Home during the later stages of the First World War, and the album had been bought by Kresen Kernow rather than given to us. Sometimes when items like photo albums, letters and diaries are given to Kresen Kernow by relatives, for example, then those relatives can provide background information about the individuals or content. But this was not the case with this album. We know nothing about what happened to it after it was compiled in 1917-1980 and when it came to Kresen Kernow in 2014. Examining the album revealed a number of useful clues as shown on the right, including dates and an image of two women labelled L Opie and T Mills. Presumably the L Opie in this image is the same L Opie who wrote their name on the inside cover of the album. But there is still no identifying information as summarised by the table, which includes rows for the typical information included in a census record. I could possibly add a location, Scoria, and an occupation, nurse, but I don't know if L Opie only lived in Scoria or only worked as a nurse temporarily, possibly just for the duration of the First World War. Searching the 1911 census at this point for someone with a first name beginning with L and the surname Opie returned 57 results, none of whom were a nurse or living in Scoria, though some are in the surrounding area. So what else? Near the front of the album is this image of nurses standing outside of a building. It's labelled the Hospital Scoria. The main hospital in the area was in Redruth town, but during the First World War, a number of buildings were converted into auxiliary hospitals to care for wounded soldiers. These hospitals tended to be staffed by VADs, voluntary aid detachments, and certainly what they are wearing looks like the typical VAD uniform. The image was originally interpreted to mean the building shown was Scoria House. However, modern images of Scoria House do not show a porch with 4 flat-fronted pillars. The porch actually looks much more similar to the image on the right, and that image shows Tregallo House in Scoria. John Williams, who lived at Scoria House, offered Tregallo House, unfurnished, as a hospital for 30 convalescent officers in August 1917, and a later newspaper article about Red Cross work in Cornwall stated the hospital opened in December 1917. So, was L Opie a VAD working at this hospital? Though there isn't enough identifying information to find L Opie in the census records, and luckily, the First World War VAD personnel cards have been digitised by the British Red Cross and are available online. There's only one result for a VAD with a surname Opie and a first name beginning with L. This is Mrs. Lucy Opie of Penrose, Clinton Road, Redruth. She worked at Tregallo House Hospital, which was called the Redruth Officers Auxiliary Hospital, between the 22nd of October 1917 and the 15th of May 1918. This time period fits with the dates recorded in the album. Is this our mysterious compiler? Well, there's no direct evidence linking the L Opie of the album to Mrs. Lucy Opie, who worked at the hospital, but it does seem highly likely, and what we know about Lucy certainly fits the known information from the album. As there is an address, marital status, and first name recorded on the VAD card, there is now enough information to search for Lucy in the decennial census records, and the census will provide essential clues to help answer those questions posed at the start of the project. This is the 1921 census, and in here, Lucy was living in Clinton Road in Redruth with her husband, Alfred Henry Opie, and her daughter Phyllis Esme Opie. Lucy was 40 years old, born in Nova Scotia, Canada, but a British-born resident, while her husband was 42, born in Redruth and a photographer. Their daughter had recently turned 18. Now, though in the First World War there were amateur photographers and photography was growing in popularity as a hobby, most people probably still would have had their photos taken only on special occasions by a professional photographer. So, does this album only exist because of this connection? Perhaps Lucy and Alfred shared an interest in photography, or Lucy took the photos, or someone from the photography business, Alfred or one of his employees, took and developed the photographs in the album. It's certainly worth considering. 10 years earlier, the family were also living in Redruth. This is the 1911 census. Now that we know more about Lucy, I'm going to return to answering those 3 questions posed at the start of the project, looking first at the final question: when and where and who did L Opie marry? The newly discovered identifying information can be included in this question to make it more focused, so the question can be rephrased as: where did Lucy marry Alfred Henry Opie in about 1902, as Lucy's husband's name and the length of their marriage, 9 years, are recorded on the 1911 census. Searching the civil registration marriage indexes revealed a likely result in the first quarter of 1902 in Redruth, the marriage between Alfred Henry Opie and Lucy Scobell. Further information would be recorded on their marriage registration, but I looked for a report of the marriage in the newspapers, which led to this wonderful account. It includes when and where they married, people who attended the wedding, and genealogical details. Then there is this lovely description of Lucy's outfit, which is a lovely detail and reveals her dress used the fashionable techniques of the time. The article finishes with a long list of all the presents the couple received, including the silver hot water jug given to Lucy and Alfred by Lucy's paternal grandmother, Lydia Scobell. Newspapers were really useful in this project, both for providing key clues to identify individuals, but also to add those little details which really bring history to life. Many Cornish newspapers are now available on the British Newspaper Archive, which can be accessed for free at Kresen Kernow, and there is also a large collection of local newspapers on microfilm at Kresen Kernow as well. Other clues recorded in the two census records were Lucy's age and place of birth. And now Lucy's maiden name is known, it seems logical to answer the first question: where, when, and where was Lucy Scobell, the second daughter of Thomas James Scobell, who married Alfred Henry Opie in March 1902, born? Comparing all the census records Lucy appears in reveals she was born in Nova Scotia, Canada. As Lucy was born overseas but alive in 1939, the easiest way to identify when she was born is to look for her entry in the 1939 register, as this resource records dates of birth rather than ages. In the register, Alfred and Lucy were still living on Clinton Road in Redruth, but they now have a live-in servant. They're highlighted in yellow on here. Living next door is Alfred's brother Arthur Edgar and his family, highlighted in orange. He was also a photographer and working for the family business. So having lived through the First World War, one wonders how Alfred and Lucy felt when war was declared again, and they provided this information in September 1939. Perhaps Lucy would be involved in bad work again, or Alfred's business would experience a surge in demand for photographs of young people in uniform or images of loved ones to be taken overseas. I did look to see whether I could find a birth registration for Lucy in Canada. Some vital records are held by the Nova Scotian Archives and are available on their website, but no registration for Lucy was found. Reading about this record set, an important thing to do, reveals that although birth registration began in Nova Scotia in 1864, it lapsed in 1877 and didn't restart until 1908. Registrations are also incomplete for the earlier period. This gap in the records is the likely reason no birth registration was found for Lucy, who was born in 1881. However, a birth registration was found for Lucy's older brother, Frederick James Scobell, in 1876, which records Lucy's parents, Thomas James Scobell and Amelia Andrew, and her father's occupation, builder, where the family were living, and possibly most excitingly, that Thomas and Amelia married on the 17th of September 1875 in Cornwall. These details will make it much easier to trace Lucy's family history further. Now, does Lucy's age in 1917 tie in with the presumed image of her in the album? This is the photograph I mentioned earlier of two women in nursing uniforms labelled T. Mills and L Opie, April 1918, the Hostel. As Lucy was born in 1881 and would have been 37 in 1918, she would have to be the woman on the left, despite the order the names are written in. Then the second, much younger looking VAD could be Tofrida Trevenan Mills, who worked in the hospital as a parlourmaid and was born in 1899, making her 19 when this picture was taken. The woman identified as Lucy appears in most of the images in the album, which adds the evidence that this was her album, though it does mean it wouldn't have been possible for her to have taken the images. The final question left to answer is when and where did Lucy Scobell Opie, born in 1881 and married to Alfred Henry Opie, die? First, I searched the civil registration death indexes, which identified a likely result. Checking the national probate calendar for England and Wales confirmed this was her and gave me an exact date of death. So Lucy Opie of Penrose, Clinton Road, Redruth, the wife of Alfred Henry Opie, died on the 24th of March 1953 at the hospital in Redruth, and probate was granted in Bodmin to her nephew George Trehane Collins, a chemist, on the 5th of October 1953. The National Probate Calendar was another source that I used a lot in this project, as it records the date of death and who probate was granted to. This is often, but not always, a relative and an address. If there are multiple possible death registrations for a personal interest, linking death registrations to probate entries can help identify which one relates to the person you're looking for because of this extra information. It also reveals that an individual left a will, and those records can be invaluable. This index and the civil registration, birth, marriage and death indexes are available on the website Find My Pass, which can be accessed for free at Kresen Kernow. I then checked the British newspaper archive to see if there was a death announcement for Lucy, or an obituary, or any information about her funeral. This search revealed that Lucy sadly died after a fall in her house. A local newspaper carried the report of the coroner's inquest. Lucy had been to visit her younger sister Florence, who had married George Norman Collins. They lived in Weybridge. After returning home, Lucy left Alice Beatrice, remember the servant from the 1939 register, in the basement kitchen and went upstairs to the first floor. Next, Alice Beatrice heard Lucy shout, "Come quickly, I am falling." Lucy was then found at the bottom of the stairs and taken to Redruth Hospital, where she died from multiple fractures and other injuries sustained. Her cremation took place at Plymouth. Lucy's husband, who was in hospital at the time of her accident, sadly died a few months later, in October 1953. So, having answered the questions posed at the start of the project and created a basic outline, I wondered what else could be uncovered about Lucy Opie's life. Lucy was born on the 26th of February 1881, and at 3 months old she was recorded in the 1881 Canadian census, living with her family in the same part of the state where Frederick James Scober was born and his birth was registered. Then between 1883 and March 1885, she moved to Lanner, a small village in Gwennet Parish near Redruth in Cornwall. This is where her parents were from. I know the family were living in Lanner in March 1885 because that month Lucy's younger brother, William Andrew Scober, sadly died aged 2. I haven't been able to find a birth registration for William in Cornwall, so I think it's likely he was born in Canada like his older siblings, and therefore this narrows down the date of the family's move. Lucy's father, Thomas James, was a skilled worker. In various records, he was recorded as a builder, carpenter, or joiner, and in 1886 he started working as a shipping line agent, selling tickets to people emigrating to various overseas destinations. Lucy's younger sister, Florence Mary, was born in 1887 and baptised in the May of that year at Lanner Wesley Chapel. In the October of the same year, Alfred Henry's younger brother, Arthur Edgar, was also baptised there. As both families were part of the same congregation, this is likely how Alfred and Lucy met. Lanner Wesley Chapel is also the same chapel where Lucy's parents, Thomas and Amelia, were married in 1875, and where Lucy and Alfred married in 1902. Lucy and her family were living on Woodland Terrace in Lanner when the 1891 census was taken. Sadly, 2 years later, in April 1893, Lucy's father died. He was only 46 years old, and Lucy was just 12. I don't know what Thomas died of, as this was not mentioned in the death registration and death announcement, so I'd have to order his death certificate to see his cause of death. Although the announcement does say he died suddenly. It must have been awful for Lucy to lose her father while still a child. However, his death doesn't seem to have affected the family financially at a time when the death of the main breadwinner might have knocked them into hardship. Thomas left a large personal estate which provided for his family. In neither of the 2 subsequent census records is an occupation recorded for his wife Amelia either. Lucy's husband, Alfred Henry, was born on the 1st of June 1879 and baptised at Lanner Wesley Chapel on the 27th of August 1881. His father then moved, on the 27th of August 1879. His father then moved to South Africa. I know this because the census records record the birthplace of Alfred's younger sister as Kimberley, South Africa. His father, Henry, also appears in South African records as he completed the death notices for 2 of his brothers-in-law when they died in a mining accident in June 1882. There are several different record sets for South Africa on the free genealogical website Family Search. Also on this website is a research wiki for South Africa, which is a good starting point for finding out about record availability, dates covered, and jurisdictions. As South Africa was a new research locale for me, this was invaluable to understand what records were created and what was available online. There is no point presuming a record exists for one place just because it exists for another. Death notices are a particularly useful South African source, as they contain information about a person's death and genealogical information, parents' names, sometimes the names of spouses or minor children, but there's no equivalent in England. These are available on Family Search, and some with a clear link to Cornwall have been transcribed and added to the emigrant database on the free website Cornwall Online Parish Clerks. So Alfred returned to Redruth before September 1884, as that is when his father opened his photography business. I know Alfred went to Trewergy School in Redruth between the 19th of July 1886 and the 14th of September 1891, because the boys' admission register for those dates is part of the Kresen Kernow collections. The archive looks after surviving records for state-funded schools in Cornwall. I don't know anything about Lucy's education, which is a little bit disappointing. There are no admission records for the school closest to her home. There is a logbook for the school, which is a sort of diary kept by the head teacher and can include interesting snippets of local history, holidays, weather, what illnesses were around, lesson content. The logbook doesn't mention Lucy or her siblings, but this is not unusual as pupils don't tend to be named in these records, unless in very specific circumstances, if they were punished or if they sadly died. So there's no evidence either way if Lucy attended this school. Logbooks, though, because of the details given, are a lovely source to look at if one survives for a school you know a person of interest attended. Alfred was living on Bond Street when the 1891 and 1901 censuses were taken, and this is where Henry's photography business was based. Also in 1901, Alfred joined his father in the business because from about February, the newspaper adverts are for H. Opie and Son. This is a comparison of Lucy's family in the 1881 Canadian census and the 1891 English census. Though there are some inconsistencies, I do believe these records show the same family because of the consistency in the names and ages of the family group and the birthplaces of Lucy's parents. Census records were really useful in identifying Lucy and Alfred and helping to put this timeline together. However, it wasn't always easy or straightforward to find the family. The surname Opie has several spelling variants and was mistakenly transcribed as Opis in the 1911 census. Lucy's first name was mistakenly transcribed as Mary in the 1921 census and actually recorded as Mary in the 1881 census. And in one transcription of the Canadian census, the family's surname was transcribed as Coble. Wildcard searching on different websites, specifically searching for different individuals within a family, or trying address searches are all useful techniques when you're struggling to find a person of interest. Here is Lucy in the 1901 census, still living on Woodland Terrace with her mother Amelia and younger sister Florence. They are highlighted in yellow. Also living on this street from the top are Lucy's maternal grandfather and aunt, James and Lavinia Andrew. Her husband-to-be's maternal grandmother, Mary Penrose, and Alfred's aunts and uncles, Emily Spargo, then Arthur Penrose and his family, and Lavinia Trewin and her family. This is probably the most family members I've found on one census page, and shows another link between the families before Lucy and Alfred's marriage in 1902. They were neighbours. This also shows it's worth looking to see who else is on a page. Okay. So the next period of Lucy's life, which we know a bit more about, is when she was a VAD. In October 1917, when Lucy started volunteering at the Redruth Officers' Auxiliary Hospital, the First World War was entering its fourth year, with no end in sight, and this was a war that people had been told would be over by Christmas. Over this period, the local newspapers are full of stories of people queuing for food, conscription and tribunal decisions, and some news from the front with a local angle, soldiers who were injured or died or taken prisoner, ordering at the Campbell Redruth Hospital, and was at home with her 14-year-old daughter Phyllis June 1916. He joined just and shortly afterwards went overseas with the army. The hospital was not open, probably helping to get the hospital ready, and as the building was given unfurnished, there was probably a lot to do. Some of these preparations are captured in the local press. In November, the committee running the hospital advertised for a large hut suitable for use as a billiards room, and later they advertised for a cook. Trevello House was used as a convalescent home. These homes were set up for soldiers in the later stages of their recovery. I think troops would have arrived in Cornwall by train. There's a wonderful newspaper account of volunteers using their own vehicles to transfer soldiers from Truro railway station to the hospital. And then as they got better, soldiers would be moved on to convalescent homes, probably to free up beds for more injured soldiers. So the focus was on rest, relaxation, recreation, and this certainly fits with the evidence. The trips the officers went on, the billiards room, and the informal atmosphere evidenced by the sketches and autographs. The war feels very far away in the album, and there's no pictures of wards or very injured soldiers. But there must have been an awareness that these officers would, sooner or later, be going back to the front lines. Lucy was matron of the nurses' hostel, which presumably provided local accommodation for the VADs working at the hospital. This makes sense, as some of the VADs' home addresses were not nearby. One nurse's home address was in London. Lucy's role was probably therefore very pastoral. She also went on many of the trips, and as mentioned, appeared in many of the photographs. So neither she nor Alfred likely took them. Alfred was in the army at this point, but he was in England for part of it, so he could have been home on leave for part of it. I think, though, that someone connected to the business, an employee, or Lucy's father-in-law, or possibly Alfred's younger brother, who I haven't found any evidence of service for yet, might have taken, or at least helped develop, these images. Lucy volunteered for 6 months to May 1918, though the hospital seems to have been open until January 1919. Alfred then came home by the March of 1919, as he stood unsuccessfully at this point for election to the Redruth Town Council. Rather interestingly, after serving for some time with the Royal Service Corps, he was commissioned into the Royal Air Force as a second lieutenant and spent some time at the RAF's photography school before going to Canada in October 1918 for 4 months. But by March 1919, the war was finally over for Lucy and Alfred, and their life could go on. Now, Lucy and Alfred had 2 children, but their second child died very shortly after being born. Their daughter Phyllis Esme Opie was living with her parents in 1921, but not in 1939. It is likely, therefore, she married and moved out. There is a marriage between a Phyllis Esme Opie and a Leslie J. Trinnaman in Redruth in 1940. This is quite late for a first marriage for our Phyllis Esme, as she was born in 1903, and it's quite a while after that latest date she was recorded at home. Is this our Phyllis Esme? Well, there are 3 death registrations for Phyllis Trinnaman. Only 2 are after the 1940 marriage, and both of them are after 1969, so a date of birth is recorded in the death index entry. Neither of those dates of birth correspond with the date of birth of our Phyllis Esme. Furthermore, those death registrations can be linked to other people in the 1939 register for their names and dates of birth. So this isn't our Phyllis Esme. A genealogy website like Find My Past has a number of different record sets. Normally, I would recommend only searching one record set at a time, choosing the most relevant based on what you're looking for. However, our Phyllis Esme seems to have vanished, so searching all the record sets on Find My Past at once could give a clue as to where she's gone. And that search revealed a result in the Great Western Railway shareholders 1835 to 1932 record set. This reveals that Phyllis Esme Opie went overseas and married Owen Llewellyn Richards. Above is her entry in a passenger list. She sailed on the Arundel Castle from Southampton to Cape Town in February 1926 and never moved permanently back to the UK. This feels like a major decision to emigrate alone at 23, but Phyllis Esme married Owen just a month later in March, and he was from Camborne, so she probably knew him before she sailed. Furthermore, both of Phyllis Esme Opie's uncles worked in South Africa. Frederick James Scobell had gone to Cape Town in 1902. He married Martha Henderson Richardson in 1907 in Durban, and he later came back to the UK. He was living in Swindon in 1939 and died there in 1950, though his obituary did mention he had recently been back to South Africa, so he seems to have maintained links with the country throughout his life. Perhaps he was living there when Phyllis Esme went out or talked to her about what life would be like. Phyllis Esme's other uncle, John Wilfred Scobell, was in South Africa in 1905 when he married Josepha Louise Thomas there from Torquay. Then, sadly, in May 1909, he was killed in a mining accident in the Transvaal area. I know Phyllis Esme returned at least once to Redruth, as one of her children was born there, but she was abroad in 1953 when both her parents died, so I don't know when she last saw them. This could be more evidence for Lucy's ownership of the album, as after Lucy and Alfred died, their house would have been cleared, and their only daughter was overseas. Perhaps this is why the album ended up, 61 years later, in a sale. Okay. So this is Lucy's family tree, as ultimately I decided that the project would be extended to attempt to identify Phyllis Esme's great-great-grandparents. I also spent some time looking into the stories of the ancestors' siblings. The project is still ongoing, but this represents what I know at the moment. So there are some missing children. Thomas and Amelia had at least one other child, because he is referred to in James's will, but he was unnamed and deceased at that time, so I know nothing else about him. I've not included him yet. Humphrey and Lydia might have had another child. Henry and Caroline, I think, had another child who died young, and Thomas and Mary also had another child, so these are things to follow up on. James Opie also married after Julia died, but I haven't included this, mostly to save space, just as only the lifespan is given for siblings rather than full dates. And there are some things to find out about some of the other siblings there. But the main thing, the gap though, is to identify Amelia's maiden name, as I don't have that, or any record of her marriage to James Andrew yet. This tree was compiled using the sources already discussed and one other key source, monumental inscriptions. Several people are buried in Gwenet Parish Churchyard, and transcriptions of those burial records are included on the free website Cornwall Mining Village Churchyards. This was useful to identify when someone died, but also to tie family groups together based on who else was buried in the same plot. These records could then be cross-referenced with the burial registers at Kresen Kernow to confirm who was actually buried at Gwenet and who was remembered on a headstone but buried elsewhere. The website also includes records for Sivians, Lanner and St Day. So I was really surprised by the number of international connections which emerged during this research. Both of Lucy's parents were born in South America, Thomas James in Mexico and Amelia in Brazil. Then there is a link to Canada, where Thomas James and Amelia lived after they married and where Lucy was born. Lucy's Aunt Mary also spent time living in Canada with her family, and she was born and married in Brazil. There's also the link to South Africa, where Alfred's family spent a few years. Phyllis Esme Opie went to live there, and Lucy's brothers work there. Alfred's uncles, Thomas and Opie, also went to South Africa, as did his uncles Alfred and Edwin Penrose and his aunt Ellen. Alfred's sister Henrietta married a mining engineer who worked in Spain, and their daughter was born there in 1909. When she later married in India, Alfred and Lucy's wedding present to her was pastry forks, and that's reported in the newspaper, which again links back to those lovely details I said you could pick up on. Another link to India is that the husband of Alfred's sister, Ellen Penrose, Arnold Baker, died at the Kola Goldfield Hospital in Mysore in January 1920. So there are so many links. I feel both of Phyllis Esme's grandfathers, Thomas James Scobell and Henry Opie, took advantage of the opportunities available to them through migration. Not only did Thomas James Scobell spend at least 2 periods of his life overseas, but he also worked as an emigration agent once he returned to Lanner. I wondered if his personal experience of migration was useful to him. Perhaps people felt he knew what he was talking about, or he used his experience to advise people. He was first a shipping agent for the Allen shipping line, selling tickets to America and Canada, and later for the Union line, selling tickets for the goldfields of South Africa. But Thomas seems to have been enterprising, and he also placed his own adverts in the paper, offering tickets to Africa, Mexico, Chile, the USA, Australia, and Canada. In one advert from 1892, he offered tickets direct from Liverpool to Mexico in just 18 days. Alongside this, he probably continued working as a carpenter joiner because when he died, his tools and materials were auctioned off by his executor. More than 500,000 people left Cornwall in the 19th century. Many of those migrating were miners, as the Cornish were seen as expert hard rock miners, and there was demand for both expertise workers and mining technology. Of course, not everyone who migrated was a miner. Thomas himself was a carpenter and joiner, but seems to have worked as a builder when living in Canada. This famous image is labelled the Weekly Exodus to South Africa and is dated a little later, about 1904, but gives an idea of how common migration was alongside these newspaper articles. In the Union Line advert, all of the practical arrangements are made for the migrant, with accommodation and dock fees included in the price, and seats reserved for Cornish passengers on a train leaving Penzance at 11:10 the day prior to sailing. I think these practicalities of how people migrated, where they went, why they went, how communities and individuals stayed in touch, the migration networks would be interesting to research further. And of course, with the library at Kresen Kernow, there are many secondary resources exploring migration and Cornish history. Henry Opie started his photography business in September 1884. The Royal Cornwall Gazette carried the announcement of the new business opening in 10 Bond Street, and numerous other adverts and announcements of the business can be found in the local press, including announcements of sales and Henry Opie taking an assistant. The business must have done well because both of Henry's sons joined, Alfred in about February 1901 and Arthur Edgar in about February 1906. You can see the name of the business changing in these examples of cartes de visite and cabinet cards from the Kresen Kernow collections. Also in 1906, the business expanded outside of Redruth, taking on studios previously run by Mr. Harrison in Falmouth, Truro and Hostel, as the most recent cabinet card reveals. They also had a studio in Tenton, outside of Cornwall. I don't know why, but that could be interesting to find out. Later, both Alfred and Henry and Arthur Edgar each had their own studio in Redruth. Alfred's in the 10 Bond Street premises and Arthur's on Penryn Street. The other reason we can guess the business did well is the family moved from living in 10 Bond Street, presumably above the studio, to 2 houses in Clinton Road, and that is quite a good address in Redruth. But how did Henry Opie start this business? He wasn't a photographer when he married, or in any of the census records prior to that. I do wonder if he made the initial money needed when he was in South Africa and or learnt how to take photographs out there, because I haven't uncovered anything about that yet either. It would also be interesting to find out if his migration was the reason he could start his business, as the business is how the family's living standards were raised. For example, when Henry's father died in 1881, he left a personal estate valued under £100. When Henry died in 1921, his estate was valued at £2,389 and 10 shillings. Though James might have previously disposed of some of his wealth, there is a big difference between these values, and they were living in better houses, as shown from the census records. But not all migration stories are this positive. This is the 1911 census for Alfred's maternal grandmother, Mary Penrose, and her daughter, Alfred's aunt, Emily Spargo. Mary and Emily were Lucy's neighbours when she was living on Woodland Terrace prior to her marriage to Alfred, and in this year, Lucy's mother, Amelia, and younger sister Florence were still living on the same street, so Lucy knew both Mary and Emily. I find this record very touching because there's a profound sense of grief and loss. Sometimes the process of harvesting the facts we are looking for from historical records mean we lose the human element, but the people on this record were real people, and those numbers crossed through reveal very personal tragedies. Mary Penrose stated she had been married for 63 years in 1911. She had had 10 children, only 3 were still alive. Emily Spargo had been married for 36 years and only one child, as she had only one child and that child had died. As Mary and Emily were widows, this section was only meant to be completed for current marriages. The enumerator has crossed through these numbers as irrelevant. But they weren't irrelevant for Mary and Emily. This was their lives. I wonder if Mary misunderstood the instructions when she filled in the schedule, or if there was a desire to record these crucial facts of her and her daughter's lives. The length of marriage recorded for both women is interesting as well, because it's from the date from when they married to the current day, not to the current time in 1911, not from when their husbands died in 1900 and 1888, respectively. So what happened? In 1882, Alfred and Edwin Penrose, their sisters Ellen with her husband and Caroline with her husband Henry Opie and son Alfred Henry Opie, were all in South Africa at the same time. Perhaps they travelled together or they went out in smaller groups after the first family members had been established themselves out there and when they knew there were further opportunities out there. On Sunday the 20th of June, there was a fire in Central Company's storeroom which caused 4 cases of dynamite stored there to explode. 24-year-old Alfred, an overseer at the mine, was killed. He was later identified by part of his clothing. His brother Edwin, aged 21 years and an engine driver at the same mine, died on the Tuesday at a nearby hospital. The coroner's inquest was adjourned, but the company believed the fire had not been started accidentally. Their sister Ellen, as the newspaper article mentions, had died at the beginning of April. I don't know what she died of. So Mary lost 3 children in 6 weeks, and 2 of her other children, Henrietta aged 4 and Thomas aged 19, had already died. Another, Lavinia Trewin, had died aged 57 in 1907. And I believe the final child died in infancy, but there are a couple of possibilities in the civil registration death indexes, so I'll have to look into this further to identify the 7th child. Emily married Edward John Spargo in the final quarter of 1874 in Redruth. He later travelled to the United States to work in a mine in Eureka, Nevada. In June 1888, Edward descended to the level he worked at, in the opposite compartment to which he was used to go. Stepping out of the cage, he went to get a candle as it was dark, but because everything was opposite to what he was used to, he fell into the shaft rather than getting the candle. Mining was a dangerous occupation, but this feels so tragic because it's such a simple human mistake. Perhaps he was in a hurry or thinking about other things. The newspaper goes on to describe the accident in graphic terms before mentioning Edward's widow in Lanner, Emily. I wonder what hopes and plans Emily had had for the future. Was she going to join Edward in the USA, or was he planning to return to Cornwall? I also think Emily's child had already died before this. So in 1911, Emily had been a widow longer than she had been married. This is the other side of the coin. For all the family members who are able to take advantage of the opportunities available to them through migration, make money and raise their living standards when they return to Cornwall or stay in another country, there are those who died in accidents or of illness far from home. As migration is such a key theme in this project, I was really pleased to notice some international connections when I looked back at the album which launched the project. One on this page is the signature of an officer who recuperated at the Redruth Officers Auxiliary Hospital. Written at the top of the page is the traditional Maori greeting Kia ora, and the officer gave his address in King Country, New Zealand. Our officer is a second lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps, precursor to the RAF, and their logo is at the top of the page. Identifying him relies on being able to read his signature, which was read possibly as Charles Gill, Charles Mills, or even possibly Charles Miller. Various First World War service records are available on the National Archives website, but because of the New Zealand connection and the uncertainty around his name, I first searched for Charles in a dataset on Find My Past called New Zealand World War I Soldiers. This is the embarkation rolls for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and I found the collection by exploring what records were available for New Zealand on Find My Past. Then I was able to find a digitised military personnel record on the National Archives of New Zealand website before looking at the TNA website where his Royal Flying Corps record would be. So on the right side of the slide is Charles Kingsley Mill's military record. The first address given is in King Country. Interestingly, Charles was an accountant before he joined the army, and we know he survived the conflict because of the date of death recorded. Charles' signature is on this form, and if it is made bigger and compared to the autograph in the photograph album, it does look the same. This is a much more direct piece of evidence than how Lucy was identified, so the identification is possibly more certain. But everything uncovered about Lucy's life fits with the evidence in the photo album, and I do think she compiled it. This project is really fascinating, and it all started from a small 13 times 17 centimetre photo album. There are only 29 pages, including the covers, but there is still so much more to discover, as several other VADs and officers are named. The sketch was probably drawn by Margaret Rich of Redruth, who worked at the Redruth Officers Auxiliary Hospital and the Campbell Auxiliary Hospital at Tregenna. On the right is a joyful cartoon showing the positive effect of a week at the convalescent home. It could have been drawn by Second Lieutenant Francois John Lear of the Royal Field Artillery, but this is just a hypothesis at this point. So there are still so many stories to unravel and so much more to find out about Lucy and her family. And this is just one item on one shelf in one strong room. And at Kresen Kernow, there are 14 miles of shelving filled with 1.5 million documents that shine a light on the stories of past people with connections to Cornwall. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kara. That was such an amazing talk. It was really interesting. Thank you very much. It's amazing to think that